1984, the book, not the year, by George Orwell, arguably the most famous, influential novel of the 20th century. It's sometimes been thought of as a universal metaphor. It is a masterwork, complete with its own neologisms, its own cultural and political lexicon, that covers not only the explicit concerns that Orwell himself faced in the early post-war era, against which 1984 was written, that is the Cold War, but rather something else. That 1984 seems to have the flexibility of addressing not only those concerns, that is, the tyranny of totalitarianism, the standardization, dehumanization of dictatorship, the corruptions of language in political life, but also an entirely new set of concerns that emerged after his death. The invasion of privacy by technology, the way in which bureaucraties and other kinds of jargons, especially academic jargon, are forms of newspeak, etc., etc. 1984, then, a universal metaphor that extends far beyond the Cold War era. Because of this applicability, Orwell was often termed, beginning in the 1950s and since then, as a prophet, the prophet of 1984. Having completed the work in 1948, he flipped the last two digits and envisioned a nightmare state of the future, 36 years away, in 1984. Put another way, the book published in 1949, half a lifetime ahead, certainly within the lifespan of the majority of readers of his time, comes the year 1984. There are various speculations as to how Orwell finally chose the title. Early manuscript revisions show that he had first selected the years 1980 then 1982, then finally settled on 1984. And previous to all of those titles was his original title, The Last Man of Europe. The Last Man being a reference to Nietzsche's Last Man. And of course, these are the words that O'Brien voices to Winston in Room 101, "You are the last man." Now, of course, O'Brien meant this, as did Nietzsche, in the transition to some kind of other creature. For Nietzsche, it was the Übermensch, the Superman. For O'Brien, it was the last human being. Henceforth, everyone will be a creature of Big Brother. If necessary, a lobotomized, robotic creature. Tutored in Room 101. Orwell, the prophet of 1984? That word, prophet, has been applied in numerous ways to Orwell since his death. And what I'd like to do today is to examine Orwell's historic reputation as a prophet, and how it is associated, sometimes very, very loosely, with his last great work, 1984. I should also point out that Orwell insisted that 1984 be written out in words, not a numeral. It's as if our reflex impulse to use the numeral as the title encapsulates the very evil of newspeak against which Orwell wrote. That is, by narrowing the title from 1984, those 3 words, down to 4 numerals, one participates in a kind of reductiveness that is of the same species as Orwell's reductive language of newspeak. Orwell insisted that the British title be written out. However, when the American publishers who published his book said that they preferred to use the numerals, Orwell did accede. He did accommodate. And so simply for purposes of convenience here today, I'll make the same request of George Orwell. We'll use the numerals. But with an understanding and an awareness of Orwell's concern. How then is Orwell be seen as a prophet? There are at least 4 major ways in which Orwell has been interpreted by different audiences at different times as a prophet. First, the cautionary prophet of the literary and political critics in the early Cold War era. Secondly, the false prophet of Marxist and psychoanalytically oriented critics who were skeptical or hostile to his achievement. Third, the fallible prophet. Futurologists, technocrats, and others have often looked to 1984 as a kind of forecasting. Also, as a work of science fiction, being more interested in the technocratic gadgetry and the different ways in which Orwell was imagining the future than in its political content. And fourth and finally, the Doomsday Prophet of the apocalyptic reader, the millennial reader. Religiously oriented, religiously minded readers who have seen the book as something more than a literary work. Let's look at these 4 different forms in which Orwell has been immortalized as a prophet in closer detail, and see what they have to do, if anything, with his novel, 1984. This is part of the vicissitudes of reputational history. The posthumous Orwell, becoming something that he never sought to be, probably would have rejected angrily, or maybe even more likely, listened to with a deep sardonic laugh. First then, the cautionary prophet. Was 1984 meant to be more of a warning to the present or a prediction to the future? Well, clearly, the former. However, because the book was projecting a future scenario, and because Orwell was clearly emphasizing, as were other like-minded intellectuals on the independent radical left of his day, that it could happen here in the near future. Orwell was taken, even by many of his peers, very critical community in New York and London as a prophet. The early post-war reviews of 1984 included headlines such as "A Prophet in the Making" in the New York Herald Tribune. "Don't let it happen. It depends on you. My book is intended to show that the English-speaking peoples are not better than others, and it could happen here." These were the press releases that Fred Warburg, Orwell's publisher at Secker and Warburg, released in order to clarify Orwell's purposes in the book. And so, this first image of the cautionary prophet was a combination of insisting that 1984 was not just a warning, but a possible prediction. If trends in the West continue, there is no reason why the English-speaking nations cannot succumb to the fate of Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. That is, become tyrannies ruled by power-hungry ideologues or one-state parties. It can happen here to us, and within the span of just a generation. This first image, which arose even with the reviews of 1984 and then solidified after Orwell's death, was reinforced by the cinematic adaptations of 1984 and 1950s. The 1953 American NBC TV adaptation, 1954 BBC TV adaptation, and the 1956 Columbia Pictures Hollywood production. In particular, the BBC TV production was a controversial and indelible moment in Orwell's history of reputation. The controversy lasted for more than a month in the British press. 1984 was aired on 2 evenings in December 1954, and it gained the largest audiences of any television program in British history to that date, even exceeding Queen Elizabeth's coronation the year before. Reports in the press were that several people were hospitalized and at least 2 women died as a result of terror and fright from watching the production. Now, by today's standards, of course, its depiction of violence was extremely tame and mild. But it is a fact that the letter columns to several British newspapers from former soldiers in World War II testify to how horrific the British public saw the graphic depiction of violence in 1984 when it came to O'Brien's torture of Winston in 101. Several soldiers wrote that they had not witnessed anything so horrible even on the battlefields of Europe during World War II. All this, along with the written work of Orwell, helped contribute to the cultural image of Orwell as a prophet. A second important image, the false prophet. False because political enemies or skeptics insisted that Orwell was projecting his inner demons on the external world. That is, that 1984 did not have much to do with the political and cultural climate of post-World War II. Rather, it had to do with Orwell's inner life. Isaac Deutscher, the biographer of Stalin and Trotsky, who was an observer correspondent during World War II and got to know Orwell personally, but never liked him, wrote an essay entitled The Mysticism of Cruelty in 1955, where he referred to 1984 as an ideological superweapon. The mysticism of cruelty had to do with Deutscher's argument that Orwell had adopted totalitarian tactics of dealing with the evils of totalitarianism, so that the extreme vision of 1984 was a horrific exaggeration of Soviet Russia, and one that was reflecting Orwell's obsession with communism and its evils. That Orwell was indeed a premature Cold Warrior who was so blinkered and so mesmerized by communism as somehow a perversion of his own socialist ideals that he could make no nuances. Everything would be swallowed up in a mystique, a mysticism of cruelty. And that 1984 then was nothing but a barbaric treatment of socialism itself. Ingstock, the party name for English socialism in 1984, bore no representation to British socialism of the day, and Orwell's caricatures of Soviet Russia were equally skewed. But it was not just Marxist critics, also psychoanalytic critics made the case that 1984 was much more about Orwell than it was about public events. 1984, according to Anthony West, was revealed to be a flawed work that had to do with Orwell's inner life by the fact that it was published not long after Orwell completed his prep school essay, Such Were the Joys. And Such Were the Joys was his memoir and critique of his prep school days at St. Cyprian's. According to West, and this was a joke that Orwell even told to some of his friends when he was lying in hospital bed, 1984 was a macrocosm of Orwell's presumably totalitarian prep school. That is to say, Oceania was like a huge St. Cyprian's, and that the proximity of Such Were the Joys in its composition, completed in 1947, and not published for reasons of possible libel until 1952 in the U.S., and not until 1967 in the UK. But the proximity of 1984 to Such Were the Joys indicated to Anthony West that the same psychology was at work. 1984 was nothing less than a big boarding school, a St. Cyprian's of Europe. And that Orwell's obsessions and compulsions were all manifested in the novel 1984. 1984 was not about the Cold War and the political situation in the wider world. It was about Orwell's own tortured inner life, feelings of failure, and haunted existence since boyhood of the beatings that he had suffered in school. And so Room 101 in 1984 was nothing more than a classroom in St. Cyprian's. Put another way, Anthony West and some other psychoanalytic critics, later Jeffrey Myers, made the case that 1984 was not about psychopolitics and social psychology, but rather about the abnormal psychology of Eric Blair / George Orwell. The false prophet. False because this was not a prophecy of what could happen in the outer world in the future. It was a thinly veiled statement of what had happened to Eric Blair in the distant past. But a third prophet image has also arisen. The fallible prophet. And the fallible prophet has been launched by a different community of readers, namely futurologists, technocrats, science fiction enthusiasts who are much more interested in the details of Orwell's futuristic scenario in 1984 and gadgetry like the two-way telescreens than they are in either the politics or psychology of the novel. In fact, they don't so much see it as a novel as a kind of tract that contains predictions. In the late 1970s, the futurologist David Goodman, in fact, enumerated 137 different predictions in 1984, and then proceeded to show that Orwell was accurate with a few dozen of them, but more than 2/3 had not been born, had not come to pass, and seemed quite unlikely to do so. In some sense, 1984 has facilitated these kinds of exercises and some readings because it has so often been paired with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is far more futuristic in its scenario, being projected more than 6 centuries in the future in 632 AF, after Ford. Orwell, having set his novel only 35 years in the future, was much more interested in showing the relationship between the political present and the political near future. In addition, because 1984 was extremely influential in the 1950s on the transformations in science fiction, it has also been treated by many science fiction readers as a kind of prediction. You see, until the 1950s, most science fiction was set in the distant future, centuries ahead. However, beginning with works like Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 and continuing on with other influential science fiction writers of that era, a shift was made. A shift arguably that had much to do with the major influence of 1984. 1984 was the first anti-utopia to appear in the 20th century set in the immediate near future. Unlike Zamyatin's We, unlike Huxley's Brave New World, and several other influential utopias, or anti-utopias, 1984, just 35 years ahead. Science fiction took a similar turn in the post-World War II era, partly in order to show that the atomic bombs that had been dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, similar kinds of disasters were on the horizon. And so science fiction of the 1950s and 1960s often featured some world just after World War III, or just after atomic or nuclear weapons had destroyed much of the human race. The time frame similar to that of 1984, as were the circumstances. My larger point, however, is that Orwell became known as a fallible prophet because as the decades continued to pass, it became less and less the case that 1984 was a series of accurate predictions about how the future would turn out to be. Now, one could say that this was testament to the success of 1984. That is, because the warning was so powerful and persuasive, the predictions were falsified. But technocratically and scientific-minded readers did not approach 1984 in that spirit. Instead, they seem to have looked at 1984 simply for its futuristic scenarios and evaluated Orwell as fallible because his prophecies were not matching the world as it was appearing. In the 1960s, books like Halfway to 1984 appeared in the late 1960s. And then, of course, in the late 1970s and 80s, numerous books like The Real World of 1984. All of these books pointing out that whether halfway or full way, the world had not turned out to be that which Orwell predicted. Fourth and finally, the Doomsday Prophet. Orwell, the Doomsday Prophet. That very adjective, doomsday, is tied to Orwell's so-called doomsday, 1984. And in particular, a community of readers that may be described as the millennialists have projected 1984 as a prophecy of the end of the world or of eschatological events. So, for instance, the Jehovah's Witnesses had several articles in the early 1980s in their magazines in which they began to claim that the world could end in 1984, as Orwell predicted. Why? Because one of the cardinal beliefs of the Jehovah's Witnesses is that there will be an ingathering of the elect within the lifetime of the beginning of the movement in 1914. Well, 70 brings us to 1984. And so the elect, the 144,000 who are saved, will witness the end of the world. Judgment Day. By the same token, Christian evangelicals especially followers of Herbert Armstrong and his magazine, The Plain Truth, were told a somewhat similar story. That is, the world will end in 1984, according to The Plain Truth, because the evils of communism will finally triumph, and it will lead to an apocalypse. Even Jewish millennialists interested in the Kabbalah participated in the predictions that Orwell was a doomsday prophet and the year 1984 his doomsday. For instance, in the Jewish mystical system of the Kabbalah, 1984 translates in the calendar of Israel to 5744. 5744, which is a date used in much Jewish literature in Israel, for example. Well, 5744 corresponds to the word tashmid, which means destruction. And so there were formal proposals in the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, to change the date 5744, because if it were kept, the state of Israel might be destroyed, and that Orwell had already projected the vision in 1984 that corresponded to this doomsday. As much as many intellectuals and others laughed at these kinds of concerns, they are part of literary or cultural history. And so, Orwell the prophet, a prophet in the making, a prophet historically? Yes. 4 different prominent audiences in the post-war era. The literary critics who proposed the cautionary prophet, the Marxist and psychoanalytic critics who saw him as the false prophet, the science fiction readers, technocrats and futurologists who labeled him a fallible prophet, and the apocalypticians, the millennial readers, the evangelicals and fundamentalists who approached his book and saw it as a doomsday, and Orwell as the Doomsday Prophet. A remarkable history of reputation, often only in the most tangential way connected to the great masterwork that Orwell composed in 1984. The prophet of 1984, George Orwell.